I want you to imagine for a minute that you are in the epiphany business. Your goal basically is to inspire everywhere you go. You want to make sure that when you leave some interaction that you have left no set of eyes unopened, no jaw undropped, no mind unblown. It might be kind of surprising if my advice to you, if you were in the epiphany business, was to get into farming. Maybe more specifically, to get into farming in a city. But our experience has been this would be a wonderful strategy if what you wanted to do was to really change people's lives, change people's outlooks. This is at the Yale farm. It's one of our school children visiting and seeing a chicken for the first time. You can kind of see the chicken in the background. It may or may not be interested. It's kind of hard to tell. But what the child's got is this sense of incredible wonderment. This is just amazing. You could do just as well by offering them to swim with the dolphins. This is a mind-blowing experience. One of our Yale students is doing what could be considered one of the worst jobs in the world, which is transplanting lettuce. And yet, for this particular moment, they have got purpose in life. They can kind of understand how they are connected with the rest of the world. And here, there's no real other way to say this is the back end of a cow. I don't think there's any language in the world that actually has positive connotations. A back end of cow, and yet this person has seen their connection with the rest of the universe is at one. This is wonderful. There's a hitch here. If you want to inspire people with agriculture, it kind of helps if you're working with people who are in cities, because people who are in cities have very little experience with farming. It's not a universal experience. This is a couple miles away from where my grandfather, at about age 15, ran away from home. He ran away from home not because he was seeking adventure, not because he was disagreeing with his parents, but because the family was starving. The family was starving during the Depression in something which has kind of repeated itself throughout history, because though we don't know what sustainable agriculture is, we have far too much experience as to what unsustainable agriculture is. And this was one of those examples. Coming to the city meant that you could escape this. The country and farming represented desperation. It represented no future. It represented no hope. The city was everything different than that. It represented a future, and the reminder of having safe, readily available, processed food that somebody else was responsible for growing gave you that assurance that you had escaped this. So when I told my grandfather that I was interested in farming and wanted to get farms started up all over the cities, you can understand it was a bit of a tough sell. Cities and farms, though, are not as mutually exclusive as one might think today. In fact, what's interesting about these two is that they depend entirely on each other to the point where we could not have cities without farms. Some of the origins of this are still apparent in the way that our cities are designed today, and you can see the tracks of this left behind. This is Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Not so long ago, prior to refrigeration, the only way that you could keep your meat fresh was to actually have the animal living nearby the city. You still had reference to Goat Town, to Pig Town, right in the heart of Brooklyn, as well as some of the best asparagus in the world on a hill on Pacific Avenue, which was rumored to be particularly good because it was fertilized by the bodies of British soldiers from the Revolutionary War. But these names still were reflected in the layout of the town. Quite recently, you'll know from New Haven that we still have Goatville, which was a largely Irish enclave where goats were still grazing. It's where I live today. And these tracks in and out of a city were shaped very much by the question of how do you get food in and out of a city. With a number of innovations, this one probably more than any changed this entirely. The advent of refrigerated transport meant that you could actually come this full separation, this vision of cities being defined as a place where farms were not. This allowed that to happen. And so now, our food comes from a global everywhere and nowhere. This has been problematic for the way that we live in our cities, for the way that we understand our connection with who we are, our impact on the land, our impact with culture. And we've been fighting with it ever since the refrigerated train car came along. This was an early interest. This is the garden city concept, which after the rail lines came along, which after the farms were driven out of the cities, was put forward as a way to recapture that connection. And you'll see the idea here of slumless and smokeless cities was saying that we can use a reconnection with our farms to basically avail us of all of the social ills which were plaguing the urbanized environment at the time. You'll notice that these calculations were done with the aim of self-sufficiency. How can we ensure that we plan our cities so that right adjacent to that urban core is enough land to grow enough food to sustain entirely that urban population? You'll also see that beyond producing food, they were also interested in this garden city concept in producing health. And using some interesting language, if you've got good eyes, you can see that some of the farms were for production, but other farms were for the waifs, the epileptics, and the inebriates. Not an integrated healthcare approach, but one that recognized that food, farming, and agriculture had something important to offer. We don't have the garden city today. This concept didn't pan out as the future of urban planning. And the way we do get our food into cities is through a tremendous feat of global logistics. You can see in New York City some of the truck routes, some of the rail routes, and some of the sea routes that brings food largely through the Hunts Point terminal. This is an aerial view of it. It's an astonishing place. About $3 billion of food goes through here a year, more than 3 billion tons. If you're interested in weird comparisons, that's more than the weight of Yale University and all of the people in those buildings. And about 60% of the produce that New Yorkers eat comes through this terminal at some point in its life. It's estimated that 20 million people are actually fed by food each day that ended up in this terminal. It takes advantage of a transportation logistics network which has become incredibly labor efficient. You can see here the idea of bringing food in by rail, which Hunts Point takes advantage of to its fullest. It takes so many fewer people to actually bring that food in. We have some transportation networks that are quite amazingly efficient today. And when you're looking at reconnecting food to the city, quite honestly, these global transportation networks can be frustratingly efficient. I did some math once to figure out in the model of greenhouse gas emissions, shipping food across the Pacific Ocean using containerized shipping, modular, realizing that on a per unit basis, there was less greenhouse gas emissions coming through that transoceanic voyage for a given pound of produce than was generated on the 30-kilometer truck drive from the port into the supermarket. Some of these methods are very, very efficient, and this is one of the reasons why we actually did not have the garden city. But the garden city remains incredibly compelling, in part because of the epiphany machine I told you about earlier, in part because of a group of ideas of psychology that I've kind of clumped together in something I like to call the Richard Scarry hypothesis, because Richard Scarry still holds a warm place in my heart. I loved those books when I was a child. This is Richard Scarry's version of farming. It's a wonderful kind of microeconomy where the farmer grows all kinds of food, keeps some for himself, and then drives the rest to busy town to take it to the supermarket where he gets an exchange for money. It's just so visible. It's just so compelling because you can see where all the pieces come together. You can understand your role in it. It's right there in front of you. And today, we're trying to reconnect the food system into the city, I think in recognition that this Richard Scarry hypothesis, this visible economy, knowing where your food comes from, has a profound impact on the understanding and the health of people in urban centers. This was a very detailed study done at Columbia University, which was assessing all the land that could be used for growing food in New York City. They came up with over 4,000 acres of land that could be suitable for agricultural production right here in the city, connected, visible, inspiring. So that begs the question, how many people could that actually feed? This is the conceptual farm that keeps one of you going for 1 year. This farm only exists because of the power of statistics. It exists nowhere in the world, and yet it exists everywhere in the world. In front of the person there are the areas that would be required for your vegetable production. That animation did not play. Is it possible to play this QuickTime animation? Not quite. Red is the fruit production. The yellow there, that's your grains. As we get into the blue, we're into the dairy, both irrigated and non-irrigated. And then, of course, the lion's share is for all of the meat and animal products, grains and rangeland. There's Klein Biology Tower for comparison. And then, of course, the Chrysler building, because the footprint of that building is roughly the footprint that you have somewhere out there in the world to feed you. This is not agriculture as it could be. This is agriculture as it is. And so the problem is that when you're in a city, each one of those squares, there's someone living on it. Expand that to the entire population of New York, superimpose it for the sake of scale onto the state of New York. There's the red, which is the city itself, the 5 boroughs. And you got the picture. You can feed a lot of minds, you can inspire, you can probably give a lot into the health and the culture of a city through urban agriculture. But there's no escaping the fact that to live at the density we live at in cities, in the past and in the future, we need farms, and we need a lot of farms. So this is TED. You're thinking, come on, think big. You're talking about agriculture as it has been. How about agriculture as it could be? You might have seen this. How about we move agriculture indoors, into skyscrapers, control every single element which right now we are just leaving up to nature, perfect control of the system, perfectly reliable and predictable output, and a handful of these skyscrapers, you could feed the entire city and turn all of that agriculture over to wilderness. The good thing about the vertical farm concept is that it does use existing technology. We use this in hydroponic greenhouses throughout the world. The bad news is that we know an awful lot about how hydroponic greenhouses work, how they perform, how much energy they use. Hydroponic greenhouses were actually one of the first case studies at the University of British Columbia when we looked at the concept of ecological footprint and initiated that term to think about a life cycle analysis impact of a particular production system and asked, how much land would it take to actually sustain that practice indefinitely? So if you want to grow 1,000 tons of tomatoes, you can either take 15 hectares of a field, or you can take a 2-hectare greenhouse. Greenhouse wins unless you start to ask about what would it take to sustain that greenhouse, keep the boilers running, keep the heat on, keep the lights on, produce the thing. And that's where the ecological footprint gives you the paradox. A high-yield greenhouse like this one takes substantially more land than the field system, which is basically getting this energy from the sun, from the soil, from the rain. And so the question not of producing high-yield things, we can do this, but sustaining them becomes one which is out of the reach of our cities. You might want me to think big once more, because this is greenhouses as they are today. How about greenhouses of the future? The Dutch government recently put a goal to have a zero fossil fuel greenhouse in operation by 2020. And so we've just got the preliminary models of how such a future greenhouse would work. The idea is, and this is a greenhouse from space, by the way, is that you would stick all of the heat, surplus heat, which is generated in the summer, into an aquifer through heat pumps. You would basically use an enormous solar battery by the water underneath that, and all the latest technology when it came to LED, supplemental lighting, incredibly efficient insulation, using basically the best and the brightest of each piece of technology that we have. They say that you could actually sustain high-output food production in a greenhouse like this on non-fossil fuel resources. In fact, you could grow it with biofuels. And it would only take, oh, we need one more animation, please. Scale again. It would only take about 35 times the land area of the greenhouse itself to sustain that non-fossil fuel output. So what I'm hoping is that we recognize that landless farming is very much a fallacy. So the question is, what do we do using the power of urban agriculture to actually sustain and support the land which will forever be required in order for us to have the urbanizing trends that are continuing today? Sometimes you need to think big and think impossible in order to get the motivating factor, to keep people interested, to keep people inspired. And so if we can put a farm on a rooftop in Brooklyn, as we've done here, if metaphorically going up onto that roof allows you to see the whole network of regional and global farms which are required to keep a city going, then let's get more rooftop farms. I think it was said best by Wendell Berry, because he's very good at saying things best. Recognize that industrial agriculture today is very much an urban invention. The responsibility for the reform of industrial agriculture, then, relies with urban people. Agriculture is land intensive. It dictates how we use the planet. Urban agriculture is people intensive. It's what allows us to actually inspire, to give those epiphanies that we talked about right now, and to build the understanding which is actually going to be required to sustain our city's food supply in the future. This again is at the Yale farm, where we consider our crops to be less about food and more about understanding, about health, about inspiration, about thinking about complex problems in fresh ways. If you have a surefire epiphany machine, you want to use it very wisely. And so that's why my hope is that with health of our cities as the goal and urban agriculture as the illuminating strategy, we can actually build the kind of sustainability which is truly needed, not just for our cities, but for our farms. Agriculture today has its upsides and its downsides. It's an incredible system, and it is allowing us to urbanize with all the benefits that that brings. It's also desperately in need of reform, and to begin to understand what those reforms are, we need to have a basic literacy of where our food comes from. The Yale Sustainable Food Project is all about promoting food-literate leadership. The kind of students who are going out into their areas, whether it's law, whether it's civic leadership, whether it's medicine, whether it's science, with a good understanding of where their food comes from and what it takes to sustain the kind of food supply needed for cities to thrive. So the city of the future, the sustainable city of the future, knows where its food comes from. And most importantly, it cares about where its food comes from. Thank you very much.